What if everything you've ever been told about Noah's Ark was only half the story? What if it wasn't just a giant wooden boat built by an old man with simple tools, but one of the most advanced engineering projects of the ancient world? A vessel so perfectly designed that even modern engineers are still debating how it could have survived. A ship with remarkable structural proportions, natural ventilation, sophisticated waste management, and logistical solutions that seem thousands of years ahead of their time. Was Noah's Ark really just a wooden ship, or was it an ancient masterpiece of engineering that we've completely misunderstood? Was Noah's Ark actually high technology, hidden in plain sight for thousands of years? Let's uncover the evidence. Forget the animals marching 2 by 2 for a moment. Forget the rainbow at the end. Strip away everything you were taught as a child, and you are left with an engineering problem so absurd that modern naval architects still argue about it in academic papers. One wooden vessel, thousands of species, food, water, and air enough to last the better part of a year, with no ports, no resupply, and no way to fix a mistake once the water started rising. Tonight, we are not asking whether it happened, we are asking something far more interesting. If it did happen, what would it actually take to pull it off? Somewhere in a shipyard that left no blueprints, no tools, and no written manual behind, a structure was reportedly built that dwarfed anything else constructed by human hands for the next 3,000 years. According to the ancient text, it stretched 300 cubits long, roughly 135 meters, longer than a modern football pitch laid end to end. It stood 3 stories tall inside, sealed with pitch lit by a single strip of window near its roofline. And into that structure, according to the story, went representatives of every kind of land-dwelling, air-breathing creature on Earth, along with the family tasked with keeping every one of them alive for months on end. Modern engineers, veterinarians, and logistics experts have spent years quietly running the numbers on this story, not to prove or disprove a miracle, but because the sheer scale of the problem is irresistible. How much food would that many animals actually eat? How do you keep a lion calm in the same building as a herd of gazelle? How do 8 human beings feed, water, and clean up after a floating zoo without a single day off for the better part of a year, using no machinery at all? Tonight, we open the hatch and go deck by deck through one of the strangest logistics puzzles in recorded storytelling. Before a single animal could board, someone had to solve a problem that shipbuilders would not fully master again for millennia. Wood is not naturally suited to enormous scale. Stretch a wooden hull much beyond about 100 meters, and it begins to flex and twist under its own weight in open water, a phenomenon shipwrights call hogging and sagging, where the middle of the vessel sags downward while the bow and stern arch upward, or the reverse, depending on how waves strike it. Wooden ships, built even 2,000 years later, with far more advanced tools and centuries of accumulated maritime knowledge, rarely exceeded this same rough limit for exactly this reason. The proportions given in the ancient account, 300 cubits by 50 by 30, a ratio of 6:1 for length against width, happened to match almost exactly the ratio modern naval architects consider optimal for stability in rough open water. Too short and wide, and a vessel rolls violently in swells. Too long and narrow, and it risks snapping in half under its own structural stress. Whoever specified these dimensions, whether through divine instruction, generations of inherited boat-building knowledge, or sheer trial and error passed down through a seafaring culture we have no other record of, arrived at a ratio that took the rest of human civilization thousands of years to rediscover through hard-won experience. Then comes the material question. A structure this size, in wood, needs internal bracing unlike anything a single family could improvise. Crossbeams running the width of the hull at regular intervals to keep the sides from buckling inward under the combined weight of everything stored inside. A reinforced keel running the entire length of the vessel like a spine to prevent the hull from bending under its own mass once fully loaded. And every seam, every joint, every place where two timbers meet, sealed inside and out with pitch, a tar-like substance that would have to remain flexible enough not to crack as the wood expanded and contracted in the water, yet strong enough to keep the entire vessel watertight for the better part of a year, with absolutely no opportunity for repair once the flooding began. Here is where the ancient text gets specific in a way that raises more questions than it answers. 2 of every kind of unclean animal, 7 pairs of every kind considered clean. For centuries, this detail was interpreted to mean 2 of literally every species alive on Earth, a number that, if taken at face value using modern taxonomy, would run into the millions once you count every beetle, every songbird subspecies, every regional variation of every creature on the planet. But a growing number of biblical scholars and researchers approach this question differently, by returning to what the original term likely meant to the people who first told the story. The Hebrew word typically translated as kind does not map cleanly onto a modern concept of species. It more closely resembles what today's taxonomists would call a family or even an order, a much broader category. Under this interpretation, the ark would not need 2 wolves, 2 coyotes, 2 foxes, and 2 jackals separately, but rather a single canine pair, understood to be the ancestral stock from which all of today's canine species would later diversify. Apply the same logic across the animal kingdom, and researchers who have attempted the calculation land on a strikingly smaller number somewhere in the range of 2,000 to 7,000 individual animals, depending on how conservatively the categories are drawn. That number changes the entire engineering problem. 2,000 to 7,000 animals, even including a reasonable share of large mammals, is a manifest that a vessel the size described could plausibly house, particularly once you account for the fact that many species are considerably smaller than the large, dramatic animals that dominate the popular imagination of the story. For every elephant or giraffe, there are dozens of species the size of a rabbit, a lizard, or a sparrow, requiring a fraction of the space, food, and water. Assume, for the sake of the engineering problem, something in that lower range of a few thousand animals. The next question becomes brutally practical. How do you physically organize that many creatures across 3 internal decks without predator and prey tearing each other apart within the first week? Modern zoo architects who have studied this question point out that the ancient account itself hints at a surprisingly sophisticated answer, even if only an outline. 3 separate decks naturally suggest 3 separate zones of activity: a lower deck for storage and waste management, a middle deck for the animals themselves, organized by size and temperament rather than left to wander freely, and an upper deck for the human occupants and for animals, requiring more light and ventilation. Within the animal deck, researchers who have modeled the problem propose organizing enclosures by body size and dietary type rather than by species, clustering grazing animals together, separating carnivores into individually secured pens, and placing the smallest and most numerous creatures, birds, rodents, insects, in stacked cages that would have taken up a fraction of the floor space compared to the large mammals. There is also the question of a detail modern researchers find genuinely compelling: the possibility that many of the largest animals aboard were not full-grown adults, but juveniles. A young, still-growing elephant eats a fraction of what a fully mature adult consumes, takes up considerably less space, and is far easier to manage and calm than an adult animal accustomed to open range. If the family aboard selected younger, more manageable specimens wherever possible, the text does not explicitly rule out the total footprint and feeding burden of the largest species would shrink dramatically, potentially by more than half. Of every challenge posed by this vessel, ventilation may be the most difficult to explain away. A wooden structure this size, sealed against a rising flood, packed with thousands of large, warm-blooded animals, each producing heat, carbon dioxide, and waste without a functioning system to circulate fresh air throughout every enclosed level. The entire population would begin to suffocate within days, long before starvation or thirst became a concern. The ancient text mentions only a single window, set near the roofline, running the length of the structure, a detail that initially seems wildly insufficient for a vessel of this size. But naval engineers who have modeled airflow through wooden hulls point to a phenomenon known as the stack effect, where warm, carbon dioxide-heavy air naturally rises and escapes through a high opening, drawing cooler, oxygen-rich air in through lower gaps and seams in the hull to replace it. A single continuous opening along the full length of the roofline, combined with the natural buoyancy differences between warm and cool air, could theoretically create a slow, constant current of air movement through the entire structure, deck by deck, without any mechanical assistance at all. It would not have been comfortable. Modern estimates of the airflow such a system could achieve suggest conditions that were almost certainly warm, humid, and thick with the smell of thousands of confined animals, but theoretically survivable provided the enclosures below were arranged with enough gaps and grating between decks to let that rising current actually reach every level, rather than stagnating in sealed compartments. It is exactly the kind of detail that separates a story told by someone who understood the physical problem from a story told by someone who did not think about it at all. According to the traditional chronology laid out in the text, the family and its cargo remained aboard for slightly more than a year, roughly 370 days, from the first rains to the moment the ground was finally dry enough to disembark. That timeline turns the food question from a matter of adequate storage into a genuine crisis of scale. Large herbivores alone would require enormous quantities of stored hay, grain, and dried vegetation, calculated not for a voyage of weeks, but of the better part of a year, for potentially hundreds of individual grazing animals. Carnivores present an even thornier problem, since a meat-eating animal typically requires its food to still be reasonably fresh, and storing enough preserved meat for months for every predator aboard, without modern refrigeration, would demand smoking, salting, or drying techniques on an industrial scale before the voyage even began. Some researchers who have worked through this problem suggest a detail the text itself does not explicitly address, but does not rule out either the possibility that certain animals were kept in a state of dramatically reduced activity, whether through the vessel's dim lighting, cooler internal temperatures, or some form of induced dormancy similar to hibernation, lowering their metabolic needs and food consumption considerably below what an active, free-ranging animal would require. Whether or not that detail was ever part of the original account, it points to the same underlying truth. Feeding this manifest for a full year using only pre-flood technology was not simply difficult. It required a level of advanced planning, storage engineering, and food preservation science that a family alone, without inherited generations of accumulated agricultural and logistical knowledge, would have had almost no realistic chance of improvising from scratch. It is the detail every retelling of this story conveniently skips, and it may be the most genuinely difficult engineering challenge of the entire voyage. Thousands of animals, confined for over a year, produce an enormous continuous volume of waste. And in a sealed wooden structure, unmanaged waste does not just create an unpleasant smell. It creates disease, generates dangerous gases, and can compromise the structural wood itself through prolonged exposure to moisture and acidity. Engineers who have modeled potential solutions point to the lower deck mentioned in some interpretations of the Ark's three-tier structure, proposing a system of sloped flooring and drainage channels that would allow waste to be regularly swept or washed down toward collection points, away from the animals themselves, in much the same way later Roman engineers would design drainage for their public baths and barracks, using nothing more advanced than gravity and a carefully calculated slope. Whether the family aboard actually built such a system, or simply committed to a punishing daily routine of manual cleaning across every level of the ship, the underlying math is unforgiving. 8 people caring for thousands of animals for over a year without a single day of outside help represents one of the most demanding logistical undertakings ever described in ancient literature, full stop, regardless of what one believes about the story's historical accuracy. Step back from the individual calculations, and a pattern emerges that is, in its own way, more interesting than any single number. Every detail modern researchers have chosen to take seriously: the hull's proportions, the single ventilating window, the 3-deck structure, the specific timeline of the flood's rise and recession, turns out to hold up remarkably well against basic principles of naval engineering, animal husbandry, and structural physics. Principles that would not be formally understood and written down by human civilization for thousands of years afterward. That does not prove the Ark existed exactly as described. It does not resolve the genuinely difficult questions the story still raises. But it does suggest something worth sitting with. Whoever first told this story, at whatever point in the deep past it originated, was not simply inventing a fairy tale with no concern for internal logic. They were describing in careful, specific, almost stubbornly practical detail a solution to one of the hardest engineering problems imaginable, using proportions and systems that would not be independently rediscovered by human shipbuilders for millennia. Whether that reflects genuine ancient engineering knowledge, later editorial refinement by more sophisticated scribes, or simply a remarkable coincidence of storytelling instinct, it is difficult to dismiss the sheer internal consistency of a story that, on paper, should fall apart the moment anyone starts doing the math. Perhaps that is the real reason this story has survived as long as it has not, because every generation who told it needed it to be literally, precisely true in every measurement, but because it captured something true about the nature of the problem itself. Surviving true catastrophe was never going to be simple. It was never going to be comfortable or elegant or easy to improvise. It was going to require exactly this kind of relentless, unglamorous planning: ventilation shafts and sloped drainage floors, feeding schedules and structural bracing. The unremarkable daily labor of 8 people determined to keep a floating world alive, one deck at a time. Every civilization since has faced its own version of this same problem in miniature. How do you preserve what matters when everything around you is being swept away? How do you plan for a year you cannot fully imagine? How do you keep going, day after unglamorous day, when the scale of what you are attempting feels genuinely impossible? The details of the Ark's construction may never be fully verified, but the discipline the story describes: patient, exhaustive, unglamorous preparation in the face of overwhelming odds, is something every generation since has needed to relearn for itself. If solving this 3,000-year-old engineering puzzle scratched the same itch it scratched for us, subscribe for more deep dives into the ancient world's strangest and most stubborn mysteries, and tell us in the comments which impossible ancient structure we should try to reverse engineer next.